The last seam that I caulked was the seam between the keel and the garboard. This seam was a little bit harder to pack the cotton in, mainly because of the oak keel, where in the other seams I was just pushing it in between the cedar boards, which are of course quite a bit softer. So in doing so, I found that it was best to use the caulking mallet and iron to pack the cotton in. In the last episode I had mentioned that I had honed down this caulking iron because when I purchased it, the 00 was supposed to be 1/32 of an inch, and it was actually over a 1/16 of an inch. So I continued to clean it up on my belt grinder so that I did get it down to that 1/32 width. And it actually worked very good for these seams. So now that I've got all of the seams and between the garboard and the keel, what is left is to take care of these tails that are left over from each one. And the reason I left them longer was so that they could go on down the stem like so. And it's really just a matter of taking the cotton and laying it together. So if I take this and twist it in here, use this to tuck it in just a little bit, and then taking the one above it and then basically just kind of weaving them together like so. You can see here that packs quite hard to pack it in there. So I'm fighting two things. One, I'm on the end grain of the cedar here, and I'm against this oak and elm, which is the stem. So once I get it started, then I can simply take my caulking iron and caulking mallet and give it a tap. Once I get that going, then I can continue to roll the cotton and put it in the rest of the seam. We'll roll that together with the next one. Take my putty knife to get it just started in there. And final strand here, we'll tuck in. Now I should mention that while I was caulking, there were some of the seams, especially that were up here near the stem, that were a little bit wider. And in those cases, instead of just pushing the cotton in with the caulking wheel, I looped the cotton and drove it in with the caulking iron. Now, one of the things I had to be careful of was not to drive too hard, otherwise I would drive it through the other side. So by looping it, it made the cotton a little bit thicker, and it caulked in there and packed in there really, really nicely. So now that we have the boat all caulked, the next step is to seal the cotton and put seam compound on it. But before we do that, we're going to need to find the waterline. So why am I going to establish a waterline at this time? Well, the next step is to paint the seams of the cotton to stabilize it, and this stops it from what they call puffing back. It also isolates it from any moisture. So in doing so, typically what you would use is some type of a oil-based primer. Many times they would use a red lead primer. That's not really available to me, so I do have some anti-fouling primer and some regular primer, some topside primer. So what I'm going to do is establish the waterline now so that I can use the anti-fouling primer below the waterline and the regular primer above the waterline. So what is a waterline? In simple terms, it's where the surface of the water meets the hull of the boat. Now in our haven, there's a couple of different waterlines that we need to establish. One is the designed waterline, the painted waterline, and the boot stripe. Now you can see the difference between the white and green here is essentially where the waterline is, and this black line is the boot stripe. So in order to establish these, let's take a look at the plans. So over here at the plans, we see that there's a line that is labeled LWL, and that stands for loaded waterline, also known as the designed waterline. To come about the designed waterline, what the designer has done is he has taken the weight of the boat plus the crew and made that equal the amount of displacement that would be below the waterline. So hence the word loaded waterline is when the boat would be fully loaded. So Joel White, the designer, has given us some information here that will help us establish where these lines need to be. And they're all based off of the construction baseline, which is the top of the strongback. The painted waterline is generally above the loaded waterline on a boat. And the reason for that is that the amount that the boat is loaded will vary depending on how many people are in the boat, how much equipment, and so forth. So by raising the painted waterline a couple of inches or so above the loaded waterline, then it establishes a nicer look when the boat is sitting in the water. If we look here at the dimensions that Joel has given us, he's given us the distance from the loaded waterline to the construction baseline, which is 24 5/8. So we put 24 5/8, and we see that he wants the painted waterline to be 1 3/8 above the loaded waterline. So if we subtract 1 3/8, then that gives us our painted waterline to be 23 1/4 inches. The boot stripe, then, he would like it to be 1 1/4 inches wide. So if we subtract 1 1/4, we then get 22 inches. So these are our two dimensions that we need to know. Is it 23 1/4 for the painted waterline and 22 inches to the top of the boot stripe. So now that we have the dimensions figured out for the stern, we need to figure out the ones for the stem. So interestingly enough is that he does not have the waterline parallel to the construction baseline. So that changes a little bit, and also he's changed the width of the boot stripe near the stem. So over here at the stem, we can see that the distance from the construction baseline down to the loaded waterline is 29 1/2 inches. So if we take 29 1/2 and then we subtract the 1 3/8 that he wanted the difference between the loaded waterline and the painted waterline. So if we subtract 1 3/8, that gives us 28 1/8 inch. So that's our painted waterline. So then here the boot strap is 2 inches in width as opposed to the 1 1/4. So the 2 inches, we subtract 2 inches, then we end up with 26 1/8 inch for the top of the boot stripe. Now that we have those dimensions established for the stem and the stern, we can now lay them out. So there's a couple of different methods that can be done for this. One would be to use a laser level. Now the laser level that I have, it's very difficult to get it not wanting to be level. And as we see from these dimensions that from the stem to the stern, it's nearly a 5-inch difference. So it's very hard to get that laser level to tip itself that way. Now the other side of that is that it was where my boat is sitting is very hard to get the level back far enough in order to shoot that. So my preferred method I'm going to use is using a string and batten. So to give you an overview on what a string and batten looks like, here in Greg's Russell book there's an illustration. So we can see in this illustration of what that will look like. So what we have are two batten boards that are level athwartship, and that there's one at the stem and one at the stern. Now, once that is established, then we can slide this string back and forth depending on the curvature of the hull. So the first thing we want to do is to set up those batten boards. So you can see what I've done here is I've established the stern end at the 23 1/4 and the stem end at the 28 1/8. What I did was I attached the back side here directly to the strong back and then used whatever I had, a stool and so forth, to support this and get it good and level. And then I used a step ladder and whatever I could find to support it on the stem end, and also leveled that up. Once I got them both, these battens both level, then I moved the level over and made a mark onto the boat on both the stem and at the stern. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take this string and I'm cutting it and I'm putting a weight on it on each end. Ideally, if you had two helpers, you'd have them help you move the strings back and forth, but given the circumstances that we're in today, and I don't have anybody around to help me, I'm going to attach these two counterweights to each side of the string so that that will hold the string nice and taut. Now that I've got the string established, where I got it as close as I can to the stern, what I need to do now is to make marks along the hull here. Now, one important thing, and you can see this by the shadow here that is created from the string, is the string is not touching the hull of the boat. And that's really important because if the string did, it could have a tendency to want to roll up the hull if you're pulling it too tight. So it's important that it does not actually ever touch the hull. So what I would do here now is I use the top of this batten board to get my eye level down even with it. And then I can sight over from the string down and make a little mark. And then move on down a little bit. Sight down the string and make a little mark. All right, now you can see where the string is lined up that it actually meets exactly where I had made that mark for the height of the waterline on the stern. So now what I need to do after I've made those marks is I'll continue around and then I'll slowly move the string over and over until I get all the way up to the stem. All right, now that I've got all of those little tick marks along there to establish that line, the next thing to do is to get a very thin batten and tack it onto the hull. You want to take this batten and line it up with the little tick mark there. And move down to the next one. Just so a little bit of that pencil line is showing. Now once we get that on there, you want to stand back and look at it and see if we have a pretty nice fair curve to it. It's pretty good. Might require just a little bit of adjustment. That's looking pretty good. One of the things is getting down parallel to what the line would be. It should appear to be a pretty straight line, which it does. Okay, so now the next step is to scribe a line in there. So as I had mentioned, the next step is to scribe a waterline in. Now there's a couple of reasons why we scribe waterlines in instead of just using a pencil line. First of all, it makes a nice clean line between the two different colors. And secondly, the boat will be painted periodically, and instead of trying to reestablish that waterline every time, by scribing a small line in there, it's very easy to find where those lines need to be. So I used the front teeth of a hacksaw blade in order to scribe that line. The hacksaw blade was just about the right thickness, and also it was very flexible so that when there was a curved part to the faired line, it bent very easily. So I scribed it down so it was just a little over 1/16 of an inch. Once I completed the waterline, I then did the same procedure for the boot stripe. So one of the reasons that it's important to plot out the top of the boot stripe the same way as I did the waterline is, though on the plans it changes from 1.25 inches to 2 inches, which I'm sure is to compensate for some kind of an optical illusion that Joel White knew of. But the important thing is, as you can see here, when I look down, it is 1.25 inches. But this direction, it's nearly 3 inches. So that varies quite a bit. But the interesting thing is that when you look at it from the side, it appears to be the same width. This is why you can't just put a piece of tape or something on there that is an even amount all the way down. It'll look funky once the boat's in the water. So the next thing is I'll scribe this line. Once I get the battens pulled off of there, there's a little bit of kind of fuzziness from the saw blade. So I just take a piece of, and this is some 80 grit sandpaper that I've just folded over, and I just put this in that groove and then just sand it a little bit like that. And that cleans it up really nicely. That's pretty much it. That's how you scribe a water line and a boot stripe. So now that I've got the starboard side done, I'll do the very same thing over on the port side. In the meantime, I need to move quite a bit of material and some machinery in order to make my batten boards fit all the way over. So as always, Thanks for watching, and I'll see you the next time on The Art of Boat Building.